Now to our speaker, Dr. Mark Miller, who is the president of Kaiviti Consulting. He's going to be talking about healthy aging and how it's determined by 5 critical key drivers.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate everyone being here the first day of the conference and everyone online. Thank you very much. Appreciate your presence. So, healthy aging is really dictated by a state of balance. And this slide is just meant to sort of give that concept of when the systems are in balance, you're in a state of health. It's when one aspect of the drivers or components gets excessive or defective that we're out of a state of balance. And so the idea with healthy aging is actually to get yourself into a state of better balance. And next slide. I'm not moving up. Ah, that was a tricky part. So, these are the 5 drivers that I'd like to talk about today. Certainly in the microbiome, epigenetics, inflammation and oxidative stress, the pairing of vitamin K2 and D3, and then the mitochondria. And actually in the abstract, I had another driver, autophagy, but it is actually a rather complicated scientific principle, and I thought it's a little less palatable in terms of incorporating natural products to correct defects in autophagy, so I switched it out for D3 and K2. All of these things interconnect. So part of the evidence that I'll be providing is showing that individually these are important, but they also interconnect with each other. And so there is certain themes running through here. And because of the time constraints, I'm just going to give you the concept, the doorway to improving healthy aging, and some evidence for that, but we won't be able to have enough time to get into all the nuances. So these are just sort of examples and doorways for further learning and further development. So let's look at the microbiome. Certainly you can have a disrupted microbiome through a number of activities. You may have a poor diet, perhaps lacking in diversity. You may have been exposed to a series of antibiotics, so you're clearing out bacteria, and so that could set up a dysbiosis. And you could also be exposed to pathogens, whether they're on a microbial nature or otherwise, that then could cause a disruption in the microbiome. The other aspect, just to point out here, and this is done graphically, is that the microbiome is not just bacteria. So we have yeast and we have phages as well. And so the 3 components are involved, particularly in the gut microbiome. So here's a little bit of evidence for the microbiome supporting healthy aging. And apologies for the complicated data, but I'll work you through it. But it's good proof of principle from this particular study, which was looking preclinically at a mouse model that has advanced aging. It's the SAMP8 mouse model. And what happens with that particular model is that there's an activation of TOL4 receptors, and that leads to activation of NF-kappa B, a master switch for inflammation. And the data, just to prove that particular element, is showing that in the second, this one here, is it? Yeah. You can see in those graphs, the second column on the left is the actual mouse model. And then in particular, what they've done is, in this model, delivered some probiotics, low and high levels, and it's corrected all of these particular elements of this dysbiosis. So as a result, the mouse model for activated senescence or accelerated aging increases the expression of these Th1 cytokines. You can see IL-1, IL-6, and TNF-alpha. And also in the histopathology, the gut becomes leakier. So there is a diminishment of the tight junctions involved in the gut, leaking in more toxins, accelerating the whole process. So this particular mouse model has the features of oxidative stress inflammation leading to accelerated aging, and it's correctable by giving probiotics. So there's an example of a problem and a therapy as it relates to aging. Another aspect or another critical driver of healthy aging is epigenetics. It's one of my favorite topics, and it's becoming a little bit more commonly discussed. We know that the difference in terms of how your genetic resources are used to determine health governs both your genetic component and also your epigenetics. So the genetic component you got from your mother and dad, and essentially that's set at the beginning of life. But the epigenetic is the component that controls which genes are turned on or off. They're switches. And they determine the sort of programming that's involved. The way that I like to sort of discuss it is your genetics is the hardware of your computer, and the epigenetics is the software. And as you age and use your software, just like if it's your computer, it becomes a little less efficient over time. And so really the goal for healthy aging as it relates to epigenetics is to scrub and clean and maintain your genetic software, that is epigenetics. And also appreciate that this needs to start very, very early in life, because there is a concept called developmental programming, which occurs starting in utero and going through early stages of life, neonates, and even small children. And that can determine your health status as you get older. So there's this concept of adult onset diseases that have been set by a corrupted software at the beginning of life. And that was a concept pushed by Dr. Barker back in the 90s. So the way that you control your epigenetics is largely two main systems. There's a series of small molecules that either methylate DNA or histones, which are the proteins that wrap up your chromosomes. Excuse me. And those small molecules are either methyl groups or acetyl groups, and they largely come from both metabolism from your mammalian cells, but often a common source is the microbiome and the microbiota. And the other one that's interesting, because it's a little bit more short-term, the software that's set with methyl groups and acetyl groups is quite persistent. In fact, it's inheritable from generation to generation. But on a moment-to-moment basis, the large proteins called transcription factors are a big determinant of which genes are turned on and off. And that is the big factor for chronic inflammation. So moving on to natural products that could affect your gene expression, there's a number that affect the transcription factors. So these are the big proteins that regulate gene expression, not the little methyl groups. And some of the classic ones, or at least my favorites, would be curcumin and cat's claw, which is a vine from the Amazon rainforest. And I spent a lot of time doing research in the Amazon and found back in the 90s that cat's claw was a very effective inhibitor of NF-kappa B. But there are other polyphenols and classic sort of antioxidants in your diet that can regulate which genes are turned on and off. And including elements like astaxanthin, which is a carotenoid family. Now, some of you may say, why is the bee doing in this picture? And it is a classic example of how form and structure can be influenced by natural products by regulating epigenetics. The queen bee maintains her role as the queen through the ingestion of a product called royal jelly, which the workers feed the queen. And if the workers decide that the queen's not really doing her job, they stop feeding her royal jelly, and she changes her epigenetic structure and reverts back to looking like a worker bee. So it just shows you diet affects form, structure, and function. And there's an anecdote. I had a work for a CEO once who I told this piece of story to, and he said he wants to get royal jelly because my boss really wanted to be the queen bee. I left that job. Moving on. So the link to chronic inflammation with this transcription factor, NF-kappa B, is really, really important as it relates to chronic inflammation. Normally, NF-kappa B is inactive. It's anchored in the cytoplasm by a little protein attachment. And when there's oxidative stress, it cleaves off that anchor, and the protein migrates to the nucleus, binds on top of DNA, and acts as a switch saying, copy me, copy me, copy me, as it relates to chronic inflammation. And the idea to negate chronic inflammation is to take that switch off the DNA and anchor it back in its inactive form in the cytoplasm. And it's relatively easy to do. So this is some data that I published 11 years ago in human cartilage, but it shows very simply the effects. So on the left-hand side, you can see the activation of NF-kappa B, and then in a dose-dependent manner, it's reduced by a component called HLM, which is just an acronym for a herbal leucine mixture. The herb is cat's claw, which I talked about on a previous slide, and together with leucine, and it inhibits this oxidative stress-induced activation of chronic inflammation by picking up the switch, removing it from the DNA, and making it inactive. And there are consequences to this. So on the other two, top panel, you can see ACAN and COL2A, which is the genes that code for glucosamine and type 2 collagen. This study was done in human cartilage cells. So cartilage cells make cartilage, which is glucosamine and type 2 collagen. And when you have immune activation or inflammation, in this case with interleukin-1, you suppress the production of glucosamine and collagen type 2. And then if you give the natural product intervention that's inhibiting NF-kappa B, you restore production of glucosamine and collagen to normal. And the bottom panel just shows that it has an impact on the release of cartilage structures. So GAG is really little pieces of cartilage. And if you have immune activation, the cartilage is breaking down. And if you suppress that chronic inflammation, you actually prevent the breakdown of the cartilage, and it falls below normal. So here you have natural products working through an epigenetic mechanism to correct the breakdown of cartilage. The other thing, and I'm not going to go into any great details here, is this concept that there's two different types of opposing switches here. NF-kappa B is driving inflammation and catabolic events, and certainly that's involved in accelerated aging. But there's another switch called NRF2. And agents that suppress NF-kappa B tend to activate NRF2, the longevity switch. So that gets back to the point I was making earlier at the beginning, that healthy aging is a state of balance. So when one switch pathway is in excess, aging is accelerated, and when you can intervene it with a natural product, you restore that balance, and so you stimulate NRF2. Now, changing gears to some nutrients that are getting very, very popular, particularly in the COVID era, because we generally, as a society, lack these two vitamins, D3 and K2. And they're actually a very interesting combination. So as it relates to sort of COVID, we do know that both K2 was low and also D3, and that puts you at great risk for the pathology of the infection. And K2 in particular is interesting in terms of its interactions with D3, in that it sort of addresses this calcium paradox that occurs with aging. And that is, we tend to lose calcium from our bones, and we tend to deposit them in our arteries. not the right place. So it's much better to get the calcium out of the arteries and put it back in the bones, given the whole problem of cardiovascular disease and osteoporosis being hallmarks of aging. So K2 has great promise as a healthy aging component working together with D3. And this slide I'm just going to skip through. It's really the data talking about the mechanisms that are involved in managing immune activation as it relates to COVID. And I think there are some other talks that get into detail as to the role of D3 and K2, and I'll leave it to those speakers. But here is a great example in current times of the pandemic where this combination is very, very effective. The last driver I'd like to talk about is mitochondria. Mitochondria being the cellular organelles that are responsible for generating the currency of energy, ATP. And by the way, mitochondria also have their own DNA. I'm not going to get into mitochondrial epigenetics as much as I would like, but I mention that because we inherit mitochondrial DNA from our mothers, and so for all the mothers out there, happy Mother's Day for last Sunday. Thank you for your mitochondria. But the structure of mitochondria are interesting because there's lots of these membranes, cristae, that are involved in housing all the machinery to generate ATP. It also has links to oxidative stress, which is one of the drivers we just talked about, because in the act of generating each molecule of ATP, we actually generate 4 free radicals in the process. So we have to control what we're doing with free radicals in order to save the cell or maintain function and not go into oxidative stress, because we absolutely require the generation of ATP. So this is an issue that over time can become defective. So mitochondria become dysfunctional. They're not effective at controlling their free radicals that they're producing, and as a result, you can have cellular damage and all sorts of complications. And the best way to, I think, approach mitochondrial health is some very potent free radical scavengers. CoQ10 is mandatory in mitochondria. It is critical for one of the processes early on in terms of the electron transport chain. And the other one that I'd like to point out is astaxanthin, because astaxanthin, unlike CoQ10, is not generated. You have to get it in your diet. That's really hard to get in your diet. The most common dietary source of that particular carotenoid is salmon. And so here, I'm just being a little self-promoting here. Here's a picture of me catching a king salmon in Alaska. After I caught it, they told me it was catch and release, which was kind of tragic. So I had to get my astaxanthin through a supplement and not through salmon. But interesting, it's really difficult to get adequate doses of astaxanthin as well, because I'd have to have 6 fillets of salmon to be the equivalent of the normal supplemental dose with an astaxanthin supplement. The other aspect about astaxanthin and protecting mitochondria is that it forms these unique transmembrane bridges. So its structure is both polar at the ends, and that embeds right across the membrane in the protein layers, and the lipophilic center is actually in the lipids of a membrane. And if there's a free radical in those lipids, it runs down the aliphatic chain and then is sequestered and removed at the polar end. So astaxanthin is the most potent free radical scavenger as it relates to what we know in nature, 6,000 times more potent than vitamin C. So to wrap up, here are these 5 drivers. They have interactions. You shouldn't just consider them individually. They do combine together. But it may be in the individual that you're trying to establish a better profile for healthy aging. Your intervention may be on one of these areas or several of these areas, or potentially all 5. But they do interact. So understand that where you're trying to reestablish balance may be influencing a wide range of activities. So, concept is there's a number of components related to healthy aging that we can interact with in terms of natural products, in terms of interventions, and establish a situation that is balanced and therefore leads to a healthy aging. The two big areas that I think that are driving this in terms of natural products are both phytochemicals as well as the microbiome contributing as well. And essentially the goal here is to enhance our health span so it matches our particular lifespan. And the picture of nature there is actually my backyard in my new home in Florida that I just moved to. You can see that I'd like to reside as close to nature as possible. So you're welcome to visit me if you come to Florida. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. Are there any questions from the audience?
Sure.
Oh, so sorry. And I'll run the mic to you.
Thank you, Sandy. Thanks, Mark. My name is Jayesh Chaudhary, Vedic Life Sciences. So, Mark, you said that all 5 approaches are important, but did I miss a master switch? Because I'm always interested in one, maybe, or two pathways, and all of these lead to that one master switch. So is there one that been identified? Not yet. Okay, but there's a lot of inflammation, and everything leads to some sort of oxidative stress and inflammation, but maybe there's not 1 or 2 switches.
It's a good point. It's a way to sort of get a handle on things. I think the 2 components, if you wanted to simplify 5 down to something even less complicated, would be NF-kappa B, oxidative stress related to chronic inflammation, because that changes cellular tissue form and structure. But also, I think the microbiome is one of the most interesting areas as well. And we do know that elderly individuals, octogenarians, centenarians, who have great longevity as well as health, have a different microbiome in terms of which species are populated. So there's something there. We're trying to understand how that works and how to replicate it in a lot of individuals. But at a biochemical level, whether it's mitochondria or influencing epigenetics, oxidative stress is a critical area.
One more question possible? Okay, so a lot of this, which you explained, is very mechanistic and not easy to explain to the consumer. Are there any supplements out there, maybe in Europe or in America, which are actually selling on aging? I mean, their main tagline is healthy aging, or maybe they are all going through joint health and...
Yes, they do, but you know, there are awards given out by different trade groups for healthy aging, so they do recognize the field in particular. I would say that in terms of connecting with the consumer, which you started to discuss as it relates to mechanisms, you need to perhaps give them a focal point that really is the component of healthy aging that is disturbed in them as an individual, and they'll gravitate to that. So it may be mobility, it may be cognitive function, it may be all sorts of things that's really driving them to the point of being a consumer and buying something. But the whole concept is still reasonably well discussed across the board. There may not necessarily be a healthy aging supermarket aisle, but you never know in the future. Hope so.